The fight to keep the population turns as much on anything as what's going on in the Detroit public schools. And I haven't gotten deeply into this issue. I have some political staff who point out to me that Mayor Adrian Fenty in Washington, D.C. was popular and got defeated in re-election because he got into the schools issue. We all saw Rahm Emanuel nearly got beat in Chicago because he got invested in the schools issue. They're like, Mike, do we really need to do schools this year? And yet, there's a point at which you can't keep watching what's happened to the future of our kids. And so I want to talk about what's going on. So you're hearing the talk. The Education Coalition, Tanya Allen and Dave Hecker and John Ricolta and Angela Reyes and Reverend Wendell Anthony. The work that they did was phenomenal. The governor has put forward another serious proposal. How many people understand this? How many people understand the difference between the Education Coalition proposal, the governor's proposal, and what's going on in this issue? Okay, in about 20, there's two hands in the room. Even Tanya is the second one, all right. In 20 minutes, I think you're going to understand the issues better, but I'm just going to talk to you about my perspective. We have people working in good faith, but we got to get this done. So let me tell you about this. There are basically three issues. One, there's $500 million of operating debt at the Detroit public schools. How do we handle it? Question one. Two, how does the DPS governance structure work? We've had an emergency manager instead of the school board, and the enrollments decline steadily. How do we run the Detroit schools in a way that people have confidence to come back to the system? And third, and in my mind, the single most important question, how do we coordinate the chaos of the 100 charter schools and the public schools so the kids start to learn in the classroom? Those are the three things. If we can deal with the debt, we can deal with who runs DPS, and we put in a system where kids learn in the classroom, we can address the problem. And those are the three issues that this boils down to. So here's Governor Snyder's proposal for dealing with the $500 million in operating debt. And what he is proposing is that you take the debt and put it in an old corporation, kind of a bankruptcy form, that you call Oldco. And here's what you do. You take 18 mills away there, being levied by the city or by the schools, paid by the city, and you take another $50 to $70 million in state funds, and you pay that off. And then you run the system out of NewCo. And the question the legislature is asking is, why is the state going to have to pay off $50 to $70 million a year for the Detroit public schools? And that's the debate that is a good question that we're going to ask. And what we have to do in order to talk about it is talk about the recent history of emergency management at the Detroit public schools. And I feel like I've been watching this train wreck, and I could see it coming. It is so similar to what I dealt with when I went into the DMC. When I became the CEO of the Detroit Medical Center and the 8 hospitals in 2004, DMC had lost $100 million a year for 5 years. And when I was hired, I had been the prosecutor, they were ready to close 3 hospitals and lay off 2,000 people to balance the budget. And I came in and I said, wait a minute. Healthcare is a business that depends on long-term relationships. Your relationship with your doctor is a long-term relationship. The doctor's relationship with the hospital is a long-term relationship. If we're always cutting and laying off, how are we ever going to succeed? And my first order of business was I stopped the hospital closings, I stopped the layoffs, and we changed the service level. We took the emergency room from 3 hours to 29 minutes. We recruited cardiologists. The time I spent at DMC, I spent 70% of my time building our customer base, our patient base, and 30% managing finances. The problem is the point at which Jennifer Granholm appointed the emergency manager in 2009 with Robert Bob. You said to the people of the city of Detroit, the schools are in a state of emergency, Robert Bob is running them. But think about schools. It's a long-term relationship. You send your kid to a high school, that kid's there for the next 4 years. You want to go to a K-8 school, you're committing your child for the next 9 years. And so she appointed Robert Bob. He had a deficit of $200 million, and he promptly closed 30 schools and announced, with what I've done, we will have a $17 million surplus in 2010. Because he cut the expenses, he knew how many students he had, right? It's going to be a surplus. And I watched this and I said, I can't believe what I'm seeing. So what happened? In 2010, the deficit had grown to $270 million. People left the system. And so he announced he was going to close 26 more schools. This time, it will be balanced. And in 2011, the deficit had grown to $363 million. Now, in fairness to Robert Bob, under this statute, he did not have the authority to run the curriculum. He couldn't address the education in the classroom. And so when people from Detroit were just being told cut and close, they all left. So he said in February 2011, I'm going to close 70 more schools, and he announced he was increasing class sizes to 60. And newly elected Governor Snyder removed him. And they changed the law. And the new law gave the new emergency manager, Roy Roberts, the authority to handle a curriculum. And Roy Roberts, who I work with closely, did as fine a job as any human being could do in saying to the public, here are the improvements I'm going to make to the schools. We're going to improve education. Come on back. Except that if you're committing to a school for 4 years or 8 years and the emergency manager's there for 1 year, it didn't much matter. Roy Roberts succeeded in slowing the decline. People just left at a reduced rate. And so what you have seen here is 3 different emergency managers, every one of them outstanding people, highly qualified executives, and all that's happened is the deficit has grown and people have left. We have to give people a quality education if we're going to reverse the trend. So the enrollment in the city has been down from the time Robert Bob went in, dropped every single year, now to 47,000. Now, it was dropping before they got it. It was dropping under the old system. It took 10 years to lose half the enrollment before we appointed this emergency manager. Now we lost half the enrollment in 5 years. Okay? It's not solving the problem. And so what does it have, what effects does it have on the classroom? So this is Darnell Early, who's doing a great job as the emergency manager. He just put out a cash flow. Now, I know this is going to sound boring, but if you pay attention, it's going to shock you. This is this year's cash flow. He's going to spend $268 million in payroll. All the teachers, all the staff, everybody this year, $268 million. This year, he's going to spend $32 million paying off the debt from 2011. That's not the whole debt. That's what he's paying out this year. And $21 million from 2012, and $41 million from 2013, and $67 million. They're going to pay out $161 million in cash. And I saw Darnell earlier. I said, there's got to be a typo. He said, it's not. He said, that debt wasn't run up in the last 4 years. It was run up over 15 years. But yeah. So think about what that says. You're spending $268 million if you pay your teachers and your salaries, and $161 million out the door in debt. These children need more teaching, more support, more music, more art, lower class sizes, and instead, this is going out the door. And the state of Michigan sold those bonds and guaranteed those bonds. And so the governor has got to figure out what he's going to do, because whether you think it's right or wrong, the fact is the state guaranteed all of those funds. And so the governor says, okay, there are legal obligations. It was guaranteed by us. Well, then some say, well, okay, why can't we kick the can down the road that's been going on for a long time? Why do we need to deal with it now? Here's why the governor's pushing it now. If you look at what's happening at the DPS credit rating has been downgraded 5 times in 6 years. Twice in 2009, and then in 13, and then again in 14, and then again just a couple of months ago. This is the numbers that look just like the city of Detroit before it went into bankruptcy. That's the direction this is heading. And so if you're the state of Michigan, you have a choice. Do I wait until we run out of cash and go into bankruptcy and the state's on the hook for everything? Or do I figure out how we manage this obligation in a way that's reasonable? And so when the governor put forward Old Co and New Co, he's saying it's better financial management to deal with this rationally. Now, I don't know if the payment for this should come from the school aid fund or from another source. But I think everybody here should agree that we can't have this money being taken out of the children of the city of Detroit. They didn't do anything wrong. Everybody should be behind Rick Snyder's Old Co, New Co solution. It's the right answer. The second issue is an area where I disagree with the governor. And we've reached the point where we can have conversations where there's no name call or anything. We just talk about why we disagree, and I hope after this he changes his mind. But let me pitch. So, We have two choices. The governor said, who runs DPS? The governor says, we're going to have a new board, 4 appointed by the governor, 3 appointed by the mayor. I wish he had given me a phone call before he announced he was having me appoint them. That wasn't a big surprise, a good surprise to me. But he says, but we'll elect 2 of them in 17 and 2 of them in 19 and 3 of them in 21, and then we'll take over. The Education Coalition says we should immediately return it to the elected school board. I'm going to suggest in this one a compromise is the right way to go, and I'll tell you why I feel that way. Is there any reason to believe that continued state control will bring students back to DPS? I mean, 95 public schools have closed since 2009. 40,000 students are left. You can say, yeah, the state has the money, we should control it, but if your customers are choosing to go someplace else, you're going to have a bigger deficit. We're going to be standing here in 2 years with not 47,000 kids, but 37,000 and a $100 million deficit and say, gee, how did that happen? It isn't going to work. And I think at times Lansing doesn't really understand Detroit, but I think this is pretty predictable. I'll tell you the second part. The governor's plan is that he appoints 4, the mayor appoints 3, but we elect 2 new people in 2017. Okay, that's the starting point. I can tell you something about City of Detroit politics. As you are enrolling your kids in the fall of 2016, every candidate for these school boards will be pledging to unseat the governor's majority and have local control. I promise you. That will be the campaign. As the city council member said, of course. So think about this. If you, I want you to think about each of you in your own individual school districts. If you had to decide next year to put your kid in a high school or in a grade school for several years, and you knew that while the governor had control today, everybody was going to try and change that, let me see with a show of hands, if you had another choice, who would put your kids in that system? Right? You can raise your hands, it's okay. Right? Nobody. Detroiters aren't any different. And so this structure is going to cause people not to enroll in the schools, which is why I think it's a mistake. On the other hand, the governor says, okay, but one of the problems is the current elected board were elected when there was no authority for them. A lot of people didn't run. Nobody was paying attention. They weren't truly elected with the expectation to run the city. And he says, if the state's going to assume the operating debt, we got to have some ability to make sure it's not run up again. Those are 2 pretty legitimate points that I think we've got to address. And so my suggestion would be this. We need to hold the school board election. If we can't do it this fall, next spring. Let's have an election. Let's elect a school board in this city that's going to lead this city forward. If you were to announce that now, you would get the best and brightest in the city of Detroit. The community would be behind the campaign. You would elect a new board that they could have confidence in. And then the question is, well, how does the state know the new board's not going to run up a deficit? We've got a precedent. Let's have a financial review board. If you followed this, as part of the grand bargain, I report and city council reports to a state-appointed financial review board. I go to a monthly meeting. They got to sign off on my budget. Any contract over $750,000, any labor agreement, they have to sign off on that today. It was passed. The City of Detroit Financial Review Board was passed by the state legislature 103-7 in the House and 36-2 in the Senate. There's bipartisan precedent. Let's have the newly elected school board report to a state-appointed board. And I think we can get the balance. The last piece to me is the single most important issue, and it's the thing that's being talked about a lot. How do these kids learn in the classroom? We have a system right now with 119,000 kids, 47,000 in public schools, 38,000 in charters, large number going outside the city, 200 schools today, half public, half charter. And there are 12 different authorizers with no control. Anybody of these 12 can authorize a school anywhere they want, anytime they want. No coordination. So what does that mean in the city of Detroit? You want to talk about chaos? We have had 164 schools opened and closed in the city in the last 6 years. So you look at this. 2009, DPS opened 10, closed 30, charter opened 5. 2010, DPS closed 26, charter opened 5. You look at what's happening year by year. In the last 6 years, 95 closed, 41 charters open. There's only 200 schools in the city, 164 open and closed. I want each of you to think about your own individual school district. If the place where your child is going in your home community had 3/4 of your schools open and closed in the last 6 years, how would you feel about your education system? But that's what we're subjected to because there's no central authorizing authority. So here are the results, and they're pretty graphic in the chaos because there's no central control. Here is the west side of Detroit. We got 3,700 high school kids, 3 high schools. There's a 15 square mile area in Brightmoor that has no high schools. But if you're in greater downtown, only a couple thousand kids, we got 11 high schools for you. Okay, well, you're really well covered. But if you're on the east side with 6,000 kids, we only have 2. How many of you live in cities that would ever tolerate this? But this is what is happening from the lack of control. And what has happened in our classrooms? Our children, only 4%. Imagine this. 96 kids out of 100 by 4th grade, they're 9 years old. And they're behind. Not only is it the worst in America, most of the big cities are at 30 or 40%, the next lowest is Cleveland at 13. We're not just at the bottom, we're all the way off the bottom. And with this kind of chaos, it's not any surprise. Math isn't any better. And here's the thing. The charters were supposed to be the saviors. Half the charters are doing no better than the worst performing public school system in America. And a number of these failing charters are opening more schools because there's no central authority. This is what we are allowing to happen. So here's what the coalition said. They said 7-member board appointed by the mayor. This was not an easy thing for me to go in and say I'd be willing to do because this is going to end the really good approval ratings I have right now. But at some point, how many times can you look at these young little kids and say you don't have a future because of the zip code you were born into? So I sat with this coalition. Here's the thing. This commission is not going to operate any schools. I do not want any part of operating schools. The public school board needs to operate theirs. The charter school board needs to operate theirs. We're not going to operate schools. We're not going to hire principals. We're not going to hire teachers. We're not going to tell you what your curriculum is. What we are going to do is establish order. I consider it like a commissioner of baseball, who doesn't tell you, sign Max Scherzer, fire Brad Osmus, but make sure everybody has an equal and fair process. So we want to bring order to the opening and closing of schools. We want to expand quality schools, and here's the central principle. Charter and public schools have to be treated equally. They should be absolutely valued equally. They should be supported based only upon whether there's quality in your school. Anybody who thinks the parents in Detroit are somehow defending a status quo have not been there. Parents in Detroit want choice. They just want good quality schools to choose from. And so I think this is what we ought to do as this commission. We ought to demand there be a single standard and fair competition. So what will the DEC do? If you want to open a school in the city of Detroit, you're going to have to come and get permission. We had 7 schools open in Southwest Detroit in 1 year. It destabilized every school that was already there. You need to come in and say, this area is geographically underserved, or we don't have this kind of curriculum. You make your case. If we have an area like Brightmoor that's underserved, we'll go out for bids. We'll say, we're going to put a new high school here. We'll let the charters and the public compete. We'll do it rationally. We need to have a central transportation system, right? 30% of our kids are in households that don't have a car, which means you get the public school next to your house and you're out of luck because most charters are not providing buses. We've got to provide some transportation so these kids really have choices. Let's give parents a report card so they can do it. Let's provide a common enrollment system so you can say Cornerstone, a charter school, is my first choice, but Chrysler Elementary, the public school that just won the chess national championship, is my second choice, but put them in order in a single common enrollment process. Let's go get the national philanthropic money. The Gates Foundation money isn't coming here because who in the world would they give it to now, right? Okay, but if the DEC is there, we could seek money for extra teaching, extra service for principal academies and teachers, after-school programs, and we provide it to the charters and the public together. And we could coordinate workforce development strategies. And here's the key thing. We've got to have the ability to close failing schools on an objective basis. So, if this were to pass, what I would envision is in the spring we would put out performance measures to every school. You'd be evaluated on test scores, but also your enrollment trends, your student attendance, the employee turnover, parent satisfaction, is a whole picture of a school. In 2016, we're going to measure you against that, and every quarter put out a report so everybody knows exactly where your school stands and what they need to do. In 2017, we're going to say to the schools that were below the targets, here's what you need to do to improve. And we're going to bring you resources. We're going to give you money for extra teacher training, extra principal training, extra school activities. We'll give you some options. But if you haven't made progress in the fall of 18, we need to close the school. That, to me, is a fair and rational process that we are prepared to lead at the local level. So if we started now, we could have the DEC in place by the end of the year. By this spring, think about what you could have. You could have students attending school fairs. You could have a bunch of high schools all lined up together. And because the kids have transportation options, they could go to a fair and have 4 or 5 high schools pitch them. Come to my school. Let them make informed choices. We'll give them decisions. Wouldn't it be something if children in our Detroit had those kind of schools? We'll give them the evaluation, and we could start fall of 16. We're ready to go. And so this was not an easy conversation. If you had seen the people in the room who had to say, I don't know about this Education Commission, they're going to be able to provide transportation. There are some charter schools who really don't want transportation coming from the poor areas to their areas. I mean, it's just the truth. You're going to have the power to close schools. And so who went along with this? This coalition that recommended everything I just said, John Ricolta, the very conservative Republican from Walbridge, Mark Royce, the vice president of General Motors, these people spent hundreds of hours in meetings on this stuff. Sandy Barua, president of the chamber, who had the courage to step in and say, we've got to do this. Also, Dave Hecker, the president of the Michigan Federation of Teachers. Imagine this. I said to Dave Hecker, if we do this, we're going to treat the charters the same as the public schools. If you're going to represent the Detroit Teachers Union, you're going to have to compete. He said, I'll sign up to compete. Who would have thought it? Right? Jimmy Settles from the UAW, Steve Hamp, one of the pioneers of charter schools, Clark Durant, another charter school operator, they all said, we're willing to sign up to do this now. And so I'm hoping that as we have this conversation, we say, and this is what I believe, and I think we're going to get to a solution, because I think there's people of good faith on all sides. Let's support the governor's old co, new co plan. Let's elect a new school board and put in a state oversight board. And let's move on the DEC so we can hold these kids, we can hold the schools accountable. I know this is the children of Detroit, but the truth of the matter is this, and Sandy Barua says this all the time, we're becoming a community where if you're born rich, you die rich, and if you're born poor, you die poor. The key to changing that is this, and the only way this is going to happen if people outside Detroit join in on this mission. We're going to get this done if the folks in this room decide they're not Detroit's kids, they're everybody's kids. Thank you very much.